Monopolies exist when there is a single or limited number of sellers, entry to the market is limited or restricted, the product is unique, and information is restricted. Go over these one at a time. A single seller. In the classic sense, a monopoly is one company owning the market for a good or service. In 21st century terms, if a few companies are able to dominate the market, they are acting as a monopoly as truly as if they were one company. Unique products. Now, I can never have a monopoly on donuts because donuts are not a unique product. But there are companies that can have a unique enough product that they have a virtual monopoly. The product being created is unique enough that not many people know how to make it or know how to make it well. Barriers to entry in the market. A company that controls entry into the market perpetuates the monopoly. A company's been in business long enough, it can make products more cheaply than anyone else, and it has production facilities working at peak efficiency. This creates a barrier to entry by producing through an economy of scale. By making many of a thing, the marginal cost for each thing is low. Government restrictions on who can operate and where they can operate also create artificial barriers. A company that owns all the resources in an industry has a natural monopoly. Like the De Beer Diamond Company in South Africa. They own like 85 or 90% of the world's diamond mines. Imperfect information. How to make the product, the process of manufacturing or refinement, the obtaining of the raw materials is very closely guarded. Now, in the beginning, there was Apple and there was IBM. IBM made computers and told everyone else how to make an IBM computer. Apple made computers, but they kept their secret, and the only way you could get an Apple was to buy one directly from Apple. Not long afterwards, there were IBM clones, IBM compatibles, and since the late 90s, even though International Business Machines no longer made a personal computer for home use, all of the machines in the computer labs are IBM PCs. Apple kept their information on how to make an Apple computer secret until December of 1994. They licensed the technology to a few companies out there, and then they quickly realized with their revenues falling that these companies were making the same quality of Apple computer but for a much lower price. This went on for just under 3 years. On August 5th, 97, Apple withdrew the licensing to make Apple clones. Now, when we're talking about a monopoly in the economic sense, the word is monopoly, just like the board game. One person controls all the land in a certain area, and once that land is locked up under one owner, that owner can do with that property whatever they want. Usually that's developing the land, and monopoly brings more money into the person's hands and leads to developing other properties. Ultimately, the winner of monopoly is who? The person who drives everybody else out of the competitive arena by controlling the board. And now a brief history lesson. Historically, when you talk about monopolies, and in the context of this class, you can either say monopoly or you can say trust. The most famous trust story is the one about Standard Oil. The year is 1860 and the country is busy tearing itself apart and going to war against itself. A young man named John D. Rockefeller was sent out by his bosses to research the possibility of digging oil wells. He came back and advised against it, recommending instead the refining of the oil that was dragged out of the ground. His recommendation was round-filed, so he went and struck out on his own. Within 10 years, he incorporated the Standard Oil Company and was worth $1 million. Sorry. Rockefeller saw there were opportunities to grow his company, so first he bought up a lot of rail interests. That was the only way that Standard Oil would be able to be shipped. Then he went out to the competition and offered to buy them out, incorporating their facilities and workers, lock, stock, and barrel into Standard Oil. Within another 10 years, by 79, Rockefeller controlled 90 to 90% of the oil refineries and a big chunk of the railroad interest to get the oil from the fields to the refineries and from the refineries to the distributors. Now, in this year, seeing that the scattered business interests were difficult to manage across several states, he moved away from having a regular company into setting up a trust. Now, initially, a trust was a way for somebody to manage the property of somebody else, but Rockefeller used the trust to manage businesses centrally. The stockholders of these businesses signed their stocks over to the Board of Trustees of Standard Oil in exchange for getting issued a trust certificate. State laws protected against monopolies and restraints of trade, which Rockefeller did by buying up the Confederates, but national law at this point did not. Instead of trusts, Rockefeller went into the concept of a holding company. Now, a holding company is a company whose sole purpose is to manage the operation of other companies by holding a majority of voting stocks in those companies. Trusts, holding companies, and monopolies grew so big and powerful that Congress promised to do something about it. The chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, John Sherman, drafted legislation in 1890 that would seek to nationalize legislation to help bust up the trusts. The Sherman Antitrust Act said that any contract, combination, or conspiracy of restraint of trade is illegal, and it prohibited the establishment of monopolies in interstate or foreign commerce. Now remember, interstate commerce, that's going to come in handy later. This was a mostly symbolic move to begin with, spawning only 18 cases in the first 10 years. And it wasn't until 1914, under President Wilson, that some real teeth were given to the Sherman Act in the form of a strong federal trade commission. Now, the Sherman Act forbade creating monopolies in interstate commerce. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gives Congress the express power to regulate interstate trade, and a bunch of Supreme Court cases, the first one being Gibbons v. Ogden in 1824, reinforced this power. Since the state laws were very patchworked and inconsistent from state to state, Rockefeller was able to manipulate the operations from state to state while barely staying on the right side of the law, while still monopolizing the industry. The biggest antitrust suit to come down the pike since Standard Oil was back in the 70s in the Bell telephone monopoly. Claiming that there was restraint of trade in the phone market, AT&T was forced to break up its holdings in the local call business, creating a bunch of smaller baby Bells, Pacific Telesis, Bell South, US West. This opened up the long-distance market to competition, but kept a lock on the local phone service. So you could choose whoever you wanted as your long-distance carrier, but if you want to make a local call, you had to use one of these companies. About 10 years later, there were efforts to open up the local market to competition, allowing long-distance carriers to provide local services. Well, guess who fought that tooth and nail? With the rise of cellular telephones and roaming charges and unlimited local and long-distance calling, this really now is moot except for people who actually have landlines. Just like the universe, those things that expand will eventually start to collapse. The AT&T Bell system was broken up into 8 baby Bells, and through a series of mismanagement and mergers and stuff like that, it collapsed back in on itself to 4 different phone companies: Verizon, AT&T, CenturyLink, and Sprint and T-Mobile. The real interesting thing, though, was in response to the Y2K problem, the federal government put the antitrust laws aside. Now, the Y2K problem, back when computers programs were being written, space for the program itself was at a premium. So, in order to catch a shortcut, it was going to be a 2-digit day, 2-digit month, and 2-digit year, like 09-21-66, because they were still in the 1900s. What they realized in the late 1990s was that even though the space for programs had radically expanded, the result of writing all of these programs with a 2-digit year rather than a 4-digit year posed a problem. They were worried that the computers would see 1159 on 12/31/99. They would think that it was now 1900 rather than 2000. And they freaked out. They spent 2 or 3 years trying to figure out how to rewrite literally billions of lines of code. There were people who were disaster preppers. They were going to town. All of the things you see on the sideline of the Weekly World News were worried. I was at Disneyland for the odometer roll to January 2000, and Disneyland turned off all of their rides 15 minutes before midnight, just in case bad things happened. The interesting thing is, in October, there was a law passed that said companies could share Y2K data and giving them limited liability against antitrust lawsuits. You may be asking, what is the big deal? The question is, what's the problem? If a company can establish a monopoly in a marketplace, should they not be allowed to exercise that power? Well, in economics, we have to consider both cost and benefit as well as risk. The assumption is that in perfect competition, there are going to be several different factors working together to benefit the consumer. Through perfect competition, we're going to be able to assume the twin benefits of productive and allocative efficiency are going to occur. Productive efficiency is where goods and services are produced at the lowest possible marginal cost. It is being produced efficiently. Allocative efficiently is where the production is based on how many the consumers want. How many do they want? That's how many they're going to make. You're not going to run into shortages. You're not going to run into overages. But with monopolies, we have the assumption of contrived scarcity and inefficiency. Now, contrived scarcity is where producers produce less of a problem than they would have if they were in competition. So instead of having the machine spit out as many as they can, they're just going to turn it back down and they're going to produce few, creating a shortage. Static inefficiency counts on the law of supply to push the scarce items higher. X inefficiency is where there's no concern for the marginal cost of production because the costs are covered in the price of the item. If you want it, you're going to pay for it. You're going to pay the price that we set. And because monopolies have no competition, they're under no market pressure to continually improve their product. They don't feel the breath of the competitor on their neck, so they can comfortably sit and produce at their own pace. However, the monopolists say that they're not monopolists, and they argue that they're not a monopoly because they're not only competing with other manufacturers, but they're also competing with themselves. They say they have to keep improving so that people will want to buy the upgrades. There's built-in competition, not just between firms, but across time. The second argument is, how can there be inefficiency and scarcity if, under the early definitions, there's a price motivation? If people want it, they're going to pay for it. The argument in favor of monopolies is that if a company doesn't have to worry about being competitive, they can devote their time, money, and effort to research and development, improving their product without the time rush to beat the other guys to the market. New products will be thoroughly tested, debugged, and be a benefit to the consumer. They can afford to do this by not having to spend their money against their competition. Looking at the extremes, perfect competition and monopoly, we need to take a look at how companies behave. Companies need to make a profit in order to remain alive. If their outlay is greater than their income, they go broke. But sometimes there are companies that are running well but financially troubled. They produce a good product but can't continue to produce and stay in the black as well. This is where other companies come into the act. When companies join forces with other companies, either by voluntarily joining or by being taken over, it's called a merger. The assets and liabilities of both companies are combined, hoping that the ailing company gets a boost and the original company has added value. There are three types of mergers. Horizontal merger is where two companies at the same level combine to increase their market coverage and make themselves larger in the process. If I were to take over Krispy Kreme, that would be great. CNN Time Warner is another example of a horizontal merger. They're both broadcast facilities. Mergers reduce the number of brand names in competition, and it could lead to a monopoly. The latest merger was between T-Mobile and Sprint. A vertical merger is where different levels of production are involved. Let's say the folks at Fram, who make the oil filters, take over Napa Auto Parts or Jiffy Lube. They have now a built-in market for their products, and they're getting their profits from possibly their competitors. The third is a conglomerate merger, where seemingly unrelated companies combine. R.J. Reynolds Tobacco and Nabisco merged, so the people who made your Oreos made your Marlboros as well for a while. You saw the same thing when the Disney company took over the California Angels and bought ABC Broadcast, the Star Wars and Marvel franchises as well. The consequences of mergers is that they might lead to a monopoly in the marketplace. Think if Bank of America were to go through the Rogue Valley and take over all of the banks here, Umpqua, Evergreen, Banner, they would say that they're maximizing their market coverage. But too much exposure in a market or in the market can strangle competition and lead to a monopoly. So how do we block monopolies? What do we do to maintain competition in the workplace, keep monopolies from restraining trade? Well, there are several methods in place to limit the ability of a monopoly arising. The first one is prohibition. The Sherman Antitrust Act, the subsequent laws and actions are one way of dealing monopolies. By forbidding them from existing, they will not exist. Right? Right. Another one is price regulation. You allow a monopoly to exist, but make the monopoly be a price taker like in perfect competition. The price is what the government sets. This is what happens with utility companies, railroads, cable companies, stuff like that. You could have government ownership of monopolies, government ownership and control. The Post Office and Amtrak are technically private companies that are fully funded by the American government. Here in Medford, we have privatization. The government has allowed Charter, or Spectrum, whichever you want to call it, to be the sole provider of cable TV service, not talking about Dish or DirecTV because those are satellite services. Charter is the only company you can get. You cannot get Time Warner Cable, you cannot get Uverse or anything like that. If you have trash in the Medford area, you have Rogue Disposal. You don't have Ashland Recycling. You don't have Rogue Valley Sanitation. Those are private companies that have been granted a license by the government to perform these services. If you park illegally downtown Medford, they are not city workers ticketing your cars. It's a private company contracted through the city. Another way to block a monopoly is to leave it alone. Through the marketplace, the market does not allow a monopoly since there are motivations from other areas to come up with substitute products. Now, the monopolist might be the only producer of a specific item, but other items that can replace it will soon spring up. Let me ask you a question. What do all of these products have in common? All of these products were once brand names. Let's take Velcro. The folks who made Velcro had a monopoly on that type of fastener. The Velcro company, Velcro was a registered trademark, other companies saw that they could make similar hook and loop fasteners that operated on the same principle, so they weren't making Velcro, they were making their own hook and loop fasteners, just like bandages, tissues, Cotton Swab's Q-tip is a registered trademark. Bubble Wrap, dumpster and porta potty. Bubble Wrap is actually by the Packaged Air Company. There are closed monopolies. These are ones that are protected by law. The Postal Service tried unsuccessfully to enforce its monopoly power over the delivery of first-class mail. They claimed in court that FedEx and UPS were breaking the law by delivering letters that were not so urgent as to necessitate overnight delivery. Basically, FedEx and UPS were trying to get into competition with the Postal Service. USPS wanted their competition to verify that each letter sent was indeed urgent, hoping that the burden would be so great the competition would get them out of this business stream. Needless to say, it didn't quite work in the Postal Service's favor. There are natural monopolies where one company dominates the market by virtue of its sheer size and power, or you have a natural monopoly by being the only guy in town. If you're the last gas for 80 miles, you have a natural monopoly. They're not going to force you to open up another competing gas station. An open monopoly is kind of the natural selection method. Usually the first person in the pool has, by definition, a monopoly, but there's no protection against others jumping in afterwards. Profits in a monopoly. Even though the firm may be a monopoly, they still have to be cognizant of maximizing profits. Your book has a really good explanation of this on pages 147 to 151. Please take those pages slow, ask questions in the forum if you're stumped, because I'm only going to emphasize a few key points. A monopolist maximizes profits by producing the quantity of output where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. MC equals MR. This makes a monopolist happy. Chart A shows the widest point of profit where costs are lowest and revenue is highest in comparison to each other. That is at the dotted line. The dotted line is 13 units. Chart B shows where MC equals MR as opposed to where demand, the price demand, would be for those items. Even though total revenue rises beyond 13 units, the total revenue is going up, the profit, the gray area in the middle, is going to fall because cost rises faster. The intersection of marginal revenue and marginal costs determine the profit maximization point for the monopolist. Let me say that again. The intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost is the profit maximization point for a monopolist. Some other things you need to know. Limit pricing is basically the monopolist undercutting the competition. The dominant firm lowers its price below the point that the competition can survive. The competition starts operating at a loss and can't recover it as long as the dominant firm keeps prices lower than what they can afford. The dominant firm has the advantage of long-term position in the market, and they have substantial assets to allow them for short-term reduction in profits or even short-term losses. Once they've boosted the competition out, the price is raised back up to pre-fight levels, or maybe even slightly higher to make up for the lack of lost profits. Price discrimination. Differential pricing for goods and services that are not justifiable by the difference in production costs. The best example of this is movie tickets. You go to the movie, well, when you were able to go to the movie before we were all locked down, when you go to the movie costs the same price to run. But there are 3 different prices based on when you were born. $8, $10, or $12. There is no difference in how the movie was made or what it takes to show the movie. The only thing is to bring people in by lowering prices for certain populations. That is price discrimination. Two-part pricing is an imposition of an additional cost in order to gain the right to shop at a certain firm, or to make you buy additional things once you're already in. Along with the examples in the book, a couple good examples we have in the Rogue Valley are Bi-Mart and Costco. At Costco, you pay $55 a year, the access fee to be a member, And in exchange, you have the right to shop in that store and get the price breaks when you buy a 50-pound bag of basmati rice. You also have the ability to go in for this Costco student lunch program, all the food that they used to give away for free. Remember, that's not free, that's Tanstaffel. Disneyland had two-part pricing. Used to be up until the mid-80s that you had to buy a ticket book, and the tickets would allow you access to certain rides based on how fun they were. The A-ticket rides were like the carousel behind Cinderella's castle, Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln. The E-ticket rides were the really good ones. They were the Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, stuff like that. The cover of the book that you see on the screen allowed you to get into the park. But if you wanted to ride the rides, you had to keep buying full ticket books. They didn't just sell packs of E-tickets or D-tickets. Each ticket, and it would be posted right here on the ride, you know, if you want to go on Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, it's an E-ticket ride. So you had to keep buying the coupon books even though you were already in two-part pricing. At Bi-Mart, you don't have to pay money to become a member, but you do have to register. This registration it's the purest sense of cost because you have to give up your time and effort not only to fill out the paperwork, but also to show your card every time you go into the store.